There's a lot of discussion going around in the last couple of weeks following the terrible murder of Sarah Everard in particular, but also the growing level of protest and anger about violence against women and what's happened to women, and how millions of women have experienced sexual assault. Millions of women don't feel safe to walk the streets after dark or on their own. This has become a very urgent question again. It's previously had times when people have regarded this as a very important question. This is one of them, and Sarah Everard's murder has brought that to the fore. And one of the arguments that's been put, and it's been put quite a lot by the Labour opposition, by some campaigning groups, by all sorts of different people, there's an argument about how we deal with violence against women. And of course, it's a major question for us. And lots of the argument comes down to should we have longer sentences? Should we have more police on the streets? Should we have more police in undercover roles, for example, in clubs and bars, to deal with some of these questions? And these are arguments that have come up before. I wanted to really try to look at those questions in particular, because it seems to me that this is really looking at an approach which isn't going to work in terms of dealing with violence against women. And I want to try and explain why. And I suppose the first way I want to do it is by looking at the fact that violence against women is not just individual acts by men against women. It is obviously that, and these are acts which have to be dealt with against individuals. It's also part of a system and part of a systemic culture which sees women as sex objects, which sees women in completely stereotyped ways, which sees women as people where it's possible for men to be able to abuse them or to be violent against them, with not that much sanction in the society in which we live. So I think we've got to look at wider society when we're looking at these questions, and whether or not we deal with this systematic sexism, this systematic oppression of women which exists under capitalist society. Do we deal with this simply by saying that we're going to have new laws which are more likely to solve the problem? And I think we have to say it's a much more deep-seated problem than that. The second thing I want to say about it is this, that actually, if you look at the role of the police in society, it is not a role which is satisfactory for very large numbers of people in this country. If you look at the role of the police in relation to Black and Asian people, you find systematic institutional racism and discrimination against those groups, systematic harassment, issues like stop and search. These are all big problems for Black and Asian men and women. It's also the case that with working class people, with poor people, with people who might be homeless, with people, with women who might not fit into the stereotypes of how women should behave, they also find themselves at the in being harassed and being attacked by the police, and certainly not protected by the police. And therefore, I suppose my first feeling about this idea that we want more police, and the idea that we want undercover plainclothes police in clubs, strikes me as the last thing that we need. This is not going to help women feel safe. They may well feel they're just going to get more harassment from the police over their behaviour. They might feel they're going to get harassment if they do anything which might be seen as illegal, such as drugs or anything like that. So I don't think that's the solution at all. When we talk about changing the law in order to protect women, let's remember one very, very basic thing, that we already have laws in this country which are supposed to protect women. We have laws against rape. We have laws against abuse of women, different forms of sexual abuse and physical abuse of women. We have laws against domestic violence. We have a society which says that it abhors all of these different aspects of behaviour towards women. So it's not that we don't have the laws. The real problem is that the laws are not seriously enforced for very, very large parts of the time. The question of rape, let's take as one example, the prosecution and conviction for rape is pretty much at an all-time low. I heard somebody on television, a woman campaigner, describing the situation over rape, and she said that effectively rape has been decriminalised in this country. In other words, if you commit a rape against a woman, which is surely one of the most serious crimes short of murder that can be committed, you are very likely to get away with it. That you either won't be prosecuted, there won't be enough evidence, the case won't be regarded as strong enough in order to bring it. And even if you do go to court, as there have been a number of high-profile cases in recent years, you will find that your own behaviour is under scrutiny, and you will find, at least some of the time, that the person that you're accusing of rape is acquitted. So when you look at this, what you're seeing is a treatment of women which, although rape prosecutions aren't meant to be about how women behave, whether they were dressed in a certain way, whether they were drunk, what their sexual history was, any of those different sorts of things. Although it's not supposed to be about that, actually, you find that very often that's exactly what the case hinges around. And the fact that the police want now to have the mobile phone records of women in order to look at their history of who they've been talking to, whether they've been having sex with people and so on, strikes me as completely unacceptable. It also reminds me of that we are going backwards in this country in regard to questions of rape and other questions of violence against women, because this was exactly some of the arguments that those in the 70s who campaigned against a few really, really notorious rape cases where the woman's sexual past and behaviour was brought out as evidence, and the assumption being that you asked to be raped if you behave in a certain way, you asked to be raped if you're drunk, you asked to be raped if you're wearing a short skirt or a see-through top or whatever it is, or that you shouldn't expect anything different if you have a history of sexual relationships with previous partners. These are all things that people campaigned over very, very strongly in the 1970s and achieved real change in terms of attitudes towards rape. I think in the last decade or maybe 2 decades, that's gone backwards again. And it's partly related to, I guess, that the whole way in which people are often pilloried as a result of what's on social media, and the fact that you can see so much more on social media in a way that you couldn't 30 or 40 years ago, but also the whole way in which society has become very, very sexualized, and people behave in certain ways because of that, which is perfectly fair enough. But then they suddenly find, when they are in a situation where they're being abused or raped or in any kind of dangerous situation for them, they suddenly find that this sexualized society doesn't treat them as though they can behave in exactly the way that they want. It treats them in exactly the way they were treated 40 or 50 years ago. And that is really unacceptable from so many levels. And I think we've got to look at this on a much wider basis than has been done. I mean, I'm very critical of the approach that Labour takes by just saying longer sentences, more prosecutions, all fine in terms of, I'm not suggesting for a moment that people aren't prosecuted. There are far too few people being prosecuted for this crime. But let's not pretend this is going to deal with the systemic problems. Let's not pretend it is going to make it easier for women to go into court and tell their stories when they've been raped or sexually abused. Let's not pretend, even with Sarah Everard, there were people saying things like, why was she walking at night? Why was she walking through a park? All these kind of questions. The assumption is that women are doing something wrong. And my argument is, women aren't doing anything wrong. They're living their lives and they have absolute right to live their lives, and we should support them in any way that we can to do so. But that this issue of sexual violence against women is not going to be solved by the kind of piecemeal solutions which do not look at the relationships between men and women, at the role of the family in enforcing sexual stereotyping, at the way in which women very often have no choice but to go and go out at night and walk alone at night because they're having to work or they're having to go out or whatever it is. I'm fed up with the idea that women are still being sexually stereotyped in this way, that if they dress in certain ways, that's unacceptable. If their behaviour points in certain directions, that's unacceptable. We have to say enough is enough. Personally, I don't believe we're going to achieve this by a few more politicians calling for longer sentences. I think we've got to be quite clear that this is part of a wider fight against an exploitative and oppressive society, which is such a burden on us all. And therefore I very much welcomed, I was part of the demonstrations which took place last week and the vigils that took place last week for Sarah Everard. I spoke at the demonstration in Parliament Square on Monday. I was very pleased to see the large numbers of women and men who turned out in support of those. And I think these are the ways, we have to find ways collectively where we begin to challenge violence against women. Of course, we challenge it individually, or we try to challenge it individually. Of course, we give help to individuals who need that help when they've been abused. Of course, we must support funding for rape crisis centres, for domestic violence shelters, for all the support that women in these terribly difficult situations need. But we also need to think about this more widely and how it can fit in with a transformative movement against the capitalist society in which we live. And therefore, to me, the fight against racism, the fight against sexism are very much linked up with the fight against exploitation and the need to transform society. And I think what we should be discussing is how we can strengthen those movements, how we can increase the number of people who are mobilising and campaigning around all those kind of things. And just one final point I wanted to make. I feel very strongly that we mustn't try to allow ourselves, our own side, all of those who oppose these terrible attacks on women and who oppose all the other things that I've been talking about. I feel we can't just treat this as isolated. I think we have to recognise that capitalist society also tries to divide us all the time on the basis of race, on the basis of nationality, on the basis of sex, on the basis of gender, on the basis of sexuality, what kind of job you do, age, even anything that they will try to do to divide one against the other and to try and separate us. And therefore, to me, I sometimes see people saying things like, well, women are protesting about violence against them, but this has been happening to blacks for a long, long time. Yes, it has. And it's also been happening to women for a long, long time. And it happens across the board. So let's not start quantifying who is suffering most. We're all suffering under this system. We all suffer as a result of this system. And the way in which we can begin to challenge that is by speaking up over these individual things, but also at looking to a much wider challenge to society. And in that, we need to be united. We need to fight together, not against each other. And I think it's very, very important we keep that in the forefront of our minds.